Haman's rise to power. Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, emerges prominently in the Book of Esther as a figure of considerable significance, described as an Agagite, a reference to the ancient enemies of the Israelites, the Amalekites. His story begins to gain prominence when he is promoted by King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I, becoming the most powerful of the nobles and second in command across the vast Persian Empire. This promotion was not merely a simple appointment, it was an extraordinary rise to power. Haman came to hold a position of immense influence, wielding near-absolute power under the king, who granted him authority to make significant decisions and act on behalf of the government. This included control over both domestic and foreign policies and the administration of various regions of the empire. With this new position, Haman expected and demanded to be treated with the deference due to someone of his status. The Bible tells us that the king ordered all the palace officials and servants to bow down and prostrate themselves before Haman in recognition of his elevated position. This act of prostration was more than a simple formality. It was a symbol of reverence and respect, an acknowledgement of Haman's authority as the king's representative. Haman's rise to power was not just a political matter. It also represented the expansion of his ambition and pride. He did not view his position merely as a role to be fulfilled, but as an opportunity to assert his own worth and superiority over others. Haman, with his newfound authority, expected everyone to treat him as a near-royal figure, and any deviation from this behavior was seen by him as a personal affront. However, Haman's meteoric rise to power also sowed the seeds of his downfall. His expectation of absolute deference and his inability to tolerate any opposition, no matter how minor, revealed a deeply proud and vengeful character. He was not merely a powerful leader. He saw himself as someone who should be revered, and any sign of disrespect was considered intolerable. This excessive pride would manifest catastrophically, especially in the conflict that would develop between Haman and Mordecai, a Jew who refused to bow down to him. But before we reach that point, it is essential to understand that Haman's rise to power was the beginning of a series of events that would unveil the true nature of his character. Haman began to use his new status to shape the empire according to his own ambitions. He started manipulating the king and the council to serve his own interests, promoting those loyal to him and eliminating any opposition. In a short time, Haman became one of the most feared and hated figures in the kingdom, but also one of the most respected by those who feared the power he represented. This rise to power is crucial to understanding the subsequent events in the Book of Esther. Haman's authority, combined with his pride and desire for revenge, created an atmosphere of tension and danger for the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. His position, initially a source of pride and triumph, would eventually become the cause of his downfall and destruction. But until then, Haman was undoubtedly a force to be reckoned with and feared. The conflict between Haman and Mordecai is one of the central points of the narrative in the Book of Esther and reveals much about the character of both men. This conflict is not merely a personal disagreement but a clash between pride and integrity, which ends up triggering a series of events with significant implications for the entire Jewish people. The confrontation began shortly after Haman's rise to power. King Ahasuerus had decreed that all the palace servants and officials should bow and revere Haman as a sign of respect for his high position. For most of the citizens of the Persian Empire, this order was unquestioned. After all, the culture of the time encouraged absolute deference to established authorities. However, Mordecai, a Jew serving in the royal court, refused to bow down or show any reverence to Haman. Mordecai's refusal was not an act of rebellion against the king, but rather a manifestation of his faith and religious principles. As a devout Jew, Mordecai believed that worship and reverence were due only to God. Bowing down before Haman, a mortal man and especially an Amalekite, an ancient enemy of the Jewish people, would be a violation of his religious beliefs. When Haman realized that Mordecai refused to bow down before him, his reaction was one of extreme anger. He did not see Mordecai's action as merely a personal refusal but as a public humiliation that questioned his authority and power. For Haman, who prided himself on his position and expected to be treated with total submission, Mordecai's attitude was unbearable. Haman, driven by his pride and lust for power, was not content to punish Mordecai alone. He saw in Mordecai's refusal an opportunity to resolve an ancient enmity between the Jews and the Amalekites. Instead of punishing Mordecai individually, Haman conceived a more sinister plan, to exterminate all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Haman went to King Ahasuerus and presented a plan to eliminate all the Jews in the empire, describing them as a people who did not obey the king's laws and thus represented a threat to the stability of the kingdom. Haman offered the king a large sum of money to finance the extermination, and Ahasuerus, trusting his prime minister, approved the plan without question. The decree was issued throughout the empire, authorizing the destruction, killing, and annihilation of all Jews, young and old, women and children, in a single day. The date was chosen by casting lots, using the pur, a type of lottery or casting of dice, which would later become the basis for the Jewish celebration of Purim. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his clothes in mourning, covered himself with sackcloth and ashes, and went into the city, lamenting loudly. The news of the decree caused great sadness and despair among the Jews throughout the empire, who began to fast, weep, and mourn, crying out for divine help. Mordecai also sent a message to his cousin, Queen Esther, begging her to intercede with the king to save her people. Initially, Esther hesitated, knowing that approaching the king without being summoned could mean death, but Mordecai reminded her that she might have been placed in the position of queen precisely for this critical moment. The conflict between Haman and Mordecai was not just a clash of egos but a battle of principles. On one side was Haman, representing unchecked pride and ancestral hatred, willing to destroy an entire people to avenge a personal affront. On the other side was Mordecai, representing faith, integrity, and peaceful resistance against oppression. This conflict marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the Jews in the Persian Empire, culminating in events that would not only save Mordecai and his people but also result in Haman's downfall. Mordecai's refusal to bow was the catalyst for a series of actions that would ultimately turn a situation of oppression into a triumph for the Jews, demonstrating that justice and faith can prevail, even against the most powerful enemies. Haman's plan to exterminate the Jews is one of the darkest episodes in the Book of Esther, reflecting both the depth of his hatred and the power he wielded in the Persian court. This plan, motivated by his personal vendetta against Mordecai, turned into an attempt at genocide that threatened an entire nation. The conflict between Haman and Mordecai, triggered by Mordecai's refusal to bow down before Haman, quickly escalated beyond a personal matter. Haman, deeply offended and humiliated by Mordecai's stance, was not content with merely retaliating against him. Instead, he decided that the best way to satisfy his wounded pride was to exterminate not only Mordecai but all the people to whom he belonged. This desire for destruction may have been fueled by ancient hostilities between the Jews and the Amalekites, from whom Haman was descended. The historical rivalry between these two nations, recorded in the Bible since the time of Saul and King Agag, predates the events of the Book of Esther and serves as the backdrop for Haman's visceral hatred. Thus, what began as a personal vendetta turned into a desire to eliminate all Jews from the Persian Empire. Using his position as second in command, Haman approached King Ahasuerus with a meticulously crafted plan. In his audience with the king, Haman portrayed the Jews in a negative light, describing them as a people scattered and separate among the provinces of the empire, whose laws were different from those of other peoples and who did not obey the king's laws. He insinuated that the presence of the Jews posed a threat to the unity and security of the empire. With this narrative, Haman successfully diverted the king's attention from the true motives behind his genocidal proposal. He presented his plan as a necessary measure to protect the kingdom and ensure its stability. Moreover, Haman offered an enormous sum of money to the royal treasury to finance the operation, approximately 10,000 talents of silver, which at the time represented a colossal amount. King Ahasuerus, perhaps blindly trusting his prime minister or simply uninterested in the details of the plan, gave Haman the royal seal, allowing him to issue decrees in the king's name. This act granted Haman absolute power to carry out his plan without further consultation or approval. The king also handed Haman the ring with the royal seal, a symbol of authority that allowed Haman to sign decrees that would be considered as if issued by the king himself. Armed with the royal seal, Haman quickly drafted the decree to exterminate all the Jews in the empire. The decree stipulated that on a specific date, chosen by casting lots, Purim, all Jews, young and old, women and children, were to be killed, annihilated, and their possessions plundered. This date, determined by the Pur, was to be a day of total destruction, when the Jewish people would be completely wiped out. The decree was distributed to all provinces of the empire, in all languages spoken, ensuring that the message reached every corner of the Persian domain. The speed and efficiency with which Haman's decree was disseminated were staggering, reflecting the extent of his power and the seriousness with which he pursued his goal. The announcement of the decree caused panic and terror among the Jews throughout the empire. It was an official and irrevocable order, backed by the authority of the king, that condemned an entire people to death. The fear and despair that gripped the Jewish community were palpable, and many began to mourn and seek divine help, as their survival seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Haman, satisfied with his work, believed that he had secured his revenge and that nothing could stop him from fulfilling his plan. He underestimated both Mordecai's determination and the divine intervention that would soon come into play. The decree to exterminate the Jews marked the culmination of Haman's plan, but it also set the stage for a dramatic reversal of fortune. The stage was set for Queen Esther's courageous intervention, which would ultimately turn the tide and thwart Haman's sinister plan. The very act that Haman believed would cement his power and eliminate his enemies would eventually lead to his downfall and the salvation of the Jewish people, as the unfolding events would demonstrate. Queen Esther's strategy and intervention. The moment Esther received the message from Mordecai about Haman's genocidal decree, she faced a profound moral and existential dilemma. Though queen, she was not immune to the dangers that the decree posed to her people. Moreover, her position was not secure enough to guarantee that the king would heed her plea, especially given the rigid protocols of the Persian court. The law of the time prohibited anyone, including the queen, from approaching the king without being summoned. The penalty for violating this law was death unless the king extended his golden scepter as a sign of clemency. Esther had not been summoned to the king for 30 days, indicating that she was not currently in his favor and that the risk of approaching him unbidden was substantial. However, Mordecai's response to Esther's hesitation was both a challenge and a call to action. He reminded her that she, too, was Jewish and would not escape the decree simply because she lived in the palace. More importantly, he suggested that her rise to the position of queen might have been part of a divine plan, placing her in a position to save her people at this critical juncture. His words, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?" resonate as a powerful reminder of the potential purpose behind her seemingly fortuitous rise to power. Emboldened by Mordecai's message, Esther decided to act, even though it meant risking her life. She asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast for 3 days and nights, without eating or drinking, and she and her maidservants would do the same. This fast was an act of deep spiritual preparation, seeking divine guidance and favor before taking such a perilous step. On the 3rd day of the fast, Esther dressed in her royal robes and approached the inner court of the king's palace, directly in the sight of the king. This moment was fraught with tension, as the fate of an entire people hung in the balance. The king's reaction would determine whether Esther's courageous act would result in her death or in the beginning of a plan to save the Jews. When King Ahasuerus saw Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and extended the golden scepter, signaling that she could approach him without fear. This moment of grace allowed Esther to present her request, but instead of immediately revealing her true purpose, she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. Esther's decision to delay her petition by hosting a banquet was a strategic move, allowing her to gauge the king's mood and prepare Haman for the revelation of her true intentions. At the banquet, when the king asked Esther what her request was, she invited him and Haman to another banquet the following day, where she promised to reveal her petition. This second banquet was crucial, as it provided Esther with the opportunity to finally expose Haman's plot in the presence of both the king and Haman himself. The suspense and intrigue surrounding Esther's actions created an atmosphere of anticipation, keeping both the king and Haman off guard and unaware of the impending revelation. During this period of waiting, an important event occurred that would further shift the tide against Haman. That night, the king, unable to sleep, asked for the Book of Chronicles to be read to him. In it, he discovered that Mordecai had once uncovered a plot to assassinate the king, but had never been rewarded for his loyalty. This realization prompted the king to ask Haman the next morning how he should honor someone who had pleased the king. Believing the king intended to honor him, Haman suggested a grand celebration, only to be mortified when the king instructed him to bestow these honors on Mordecai. This unexpected turn of events marked the beginning of Haman's downfall, as the man he sought to destroy was publicly honored by the king. It also set the stage for Esther's ultimate revelation at the second banquet, where she would expose Haman's plot to annihilate her people, leading to a dramatic reversal of fortune that would culminate in Haman's execution and the salvation of the Jews. Esther's revelation and Haman's downfall. The second banquet hosted by Esther was the pivotal moment in the book of Esther, where the fate of the Jewish people would be determined. As King Ahasuerus and Haman attended the banquet, they were still unaware of the true purpose behind Esther's invitation. As the banquet progressed, the king again asked Esther what her request was, assuring her that he would grant her anything she desired, even up to half the kingdom. This was the moment Esther had been preparing for. With great courage, she finally revealed her true request. She asked for her life and the lives of her people to be spared. Esther's revelation stunned the king. He had no idea that his beloved queen was Jewish or that the decree Haman had engineered was a threat to her life. Esther explained that she and her people had been sold for destruction and annihilation, and if they had merely been sold as slaves, she would have remained silent. But this was a matter of life and death, not just for her, but for an entire nation. King Ahasuerus, enraged and bewildered, demanded to know who would dare to threaten his queen and her people. Esther pointed directly at Haman, accusing him as the enemy and adversary behind the plot. The king, filled with wrath, stormed out into the palace garden, leaving Haman to realize the gravity of his situation. Haman, now terrified, stayed behind to plead with Queen Esther for his life. He knew that the king's anger could mean his immediate execution. However, as he threw himself on Esther's couch to beg for mercy, the king returned, and this act of desperation was misinterpreted as an assault on the queen. This further enraged the king, who ordered Haman to be executed immediately. One of the king's servants, Harbona, suggested that Haman be hanged on the very gallows he had built to execute Mordecai. The king agreed, and Haman was hanged on the gallows he had prepared for his enemy. This ironic twist of fate not only brought an end to Haman's life but also marked the beginning of the Jews' deliverance from the threat of annihilation. With Haman's death, the immediate danger to the Jews was neutralized, but the decree to exterminate them still stood, as it was an irrevocable law of the Medes and Persians. However, Queen Esther, with the support of Mordecai, who was now elevated to a position of power, devised a plan to counteract the decree. Mordecai was given Haman's position and authority, and Esther pleaded with the king to issue a new decree that would allow the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. The king granted this request, and a new decree was issued, allowing the Jews throughout the empire to gather, defend themselves, and destroy any armed forces that would attack them. When the appointed day arrived, the Jews successfully defended themselves against their enemies. Instead of being destroyed, they triumphed, and many of those who sought to harm them were killed. This victory was celebrated with great joy and relief, and it became the basis for the Jewish festival of Purim, which commemorates the deliverance of the Jewish people from Haman's plot. Haman's downfall was a dramatic demonstration of the dangers of pride, hatred, and the abuse of power. His rise to power, driven by ambition and a desire for revenge, ultimately led to his destruction. In contrast, Esther's courage, wisdom, and faith played a crucial role in saving her people, turning a moment of great peril into one of triumph and celebration.